if you've tried to use an SCT with a focal reducer on a fork mount, like these single arm fork mounts from Celestron, the SE mount here and the Evolution mount here, or a dual fork mount like Celestron's CPC mount, you've probably already found that you're kind of restricted in how close to the zenith you can point without your optical train smashing into the base of the mount. In fact, on this 6-inch SCT on the SE mount, I can't get any higher than about 65 degrees. Now in the case of this 8-inch SCT on the Evolution mount, you can go closer to the zenith, but you're still restricted in that area of the sky because of the low clearance between the base of the OTA and the mount itself, and the amount of optical path length we have to add based on the requirement of the focal reducer. Now in this video, I'm going to show you the two basic solutions to that problem, and I'm going to show you a variation on each of those if you want to use a filter drawer in the optical path when using a camera with your SCT. I also want to let you know this is not a sponsored video. Everything that I use in the video I've either owned for a long time, borrowed to make the video, or in the case of all these spacers and adapters, bought just for the purposes of this video. Now I'm also going to focus on the non-edge mount solution, since the edge focal reducer requires a different optical spacing than the non-edge reducer from Celestron. But I will make some comments on the solution for the edge telescopes towards the end of this video. The first approach to the back focus spacing is the straight through approach. Here we just have a coupler and a series of spacers to achieve 105 millimeters back focus without putting any additional optical surfaces in the light path. That will help us to avoid any reflected light, which is reducing the amount of light reaching the camera. It'll prevent any additional optical aberrations by extra optics in the light path. And because the clear aperture of the spacers is close to 40 millimeters, it will minimize any potential vignetting. The disadvantage of this approach is that you're going to have a longer rail or use a rail extension and push your OTA further forward. And especially when you get onto the larger OTAs, especially the 8-inch on a SE mount, you may find that your setup is a little bit more sensitive to vibrations when it's pushed further forward. So that's the first approach. We will go through all the details that you need to know in order to try this approach. The second approach to achieving the correct backspacing is to use a right angle diagonal. Now the advantage of this approach is that, number one, you don't have to put a longer rail or a rail extension and slide the OTA so far forward. That will provide you with better stability than when you have to slide the OTA forward in the mount. The second advantage is the fact that you have plenty of room here to use a cooled camera, whereas with the straight through approach, a cooled camera may not be compatible with some OTA mount configurations. Now there are three basic disadvantages of this approach. First of all, the diagonal can be expensive. This diagonal is the cheapest I could find that would work with this, and that's $141. Second, by putting a diagonal with additional optics in the light path, you're subject to some light loss and potential aberrations. And third, the clear aperture here is only 30 millimeters, and you will get some vignetting, but that can be taken care of if you use light frames, and SharpCap has that ability to do light frame calibration live while stacking. I will give you all the information you need to replicate this back focus solution, but first I want to address a couple of key questions. First, what is the exact back focus spacing that we need? Second, how do we measure it? Third, how tight of tolerance is required for that? And what happens if we vary that spacing more or less? And fourth, what if you're using a different camera than one of the cameras I'm showing you here? Well, if you look online, for instance on Agena Astro's website, under their tutorial on focal reducers, you'll see that they say the correct back focus spacing for this Celestron 0.63x focal reducer is 105 millimeters. However, if you look on the astronomy forums, you'll see other people who say it's actually 100 millimeters. Some will say 110 millimeters. So there's a lot of different variations of numbers that you can find out there on the internet. And surprisingly, Celestron doesn't, anywhere that I can find, specify the correct back focus spacing for this focal reducer. So what is it? Is it 105, 110, or something else? In order to answer that question, I think we need to look at the back focus spacing standard for a refractor when using a focal reducer or a field flattener. Now, if you look that up, you'll find that the industry standard is 55 millimeters. Not 105, but 55 millimeters. Okay, so how do I get 105 from that? Now, a refractor is a very different optical device than a Schmidt-Cassegrain, and I don't think it's possible to make the focal reducer for the Schmidt-Cassegrain that has a backspacing of 55 millimeters. But what I think Celestron did is the next best thing. So they provided an SCT adapter which screws on to the back of the focal reducer, which has an exact optical path length of 50 millimeters. So take 105, subtract 50 from it, and you get, that's right, 55 millimeters. So I think they were trying to make it easy for us that we could use the same couplers and spacers we use with focal reducers and our camera on a refractor, and provide us with the extra 50 millimeters needed to get to 105 millimeters with the coupler that they sell. Now, still not convinced? Now let's take a look at the Celestron Edge focal reducer. Now, in the case of the Edge focal reducer, Celestron does specify the back focus distance at 146 millimeters. Now they make a coupler for the Edge, similar to the coupler I showed you before for the non-Edge reducer, and that attaches in the same way, screws on to the back of the focal reducer, and this has an optical path length of 91 millimeters. So take 146 minus 91, leaves you with our magic number of 55 millimeters. My conclusion is the correct back focus distance is 105 millimeters, and that's what I'm going to assume in this video. Now the next question is, where do you measure that from? And I think this is the reason for so much confusion about the correct back focus spacing. Now you'll see a variety of different positions mentioned online. Some the edge of the threads, some this flange back here, which is about 10 millimeters from the back coupling surface. Others even talk about doing the measurement from the center of the optical elements, although I'm not sure how they get those elements. I think all that is not right. I think it's very simple. The back edge of this flat surface and the back edge of this flat surface mate, and that's where the distance is measured from. The same is true on the edge, where the back edge of this flat surface attaches to the back edge of that. So I think it's as simple as that, not any more complicated. So the purposes of this video, we're going to assume 105 millimeters, and we're going to assume that is where this coupling surface is on the focal reducer itself. So you might be wondering how tight a tolerance on 105 millimeters back focus distance is required. Well, to be honest, I don't really know, but my guess is the optics are designed to work optimally within plus or minus 1 millimeter of 105. So that's why I'm trying to show you how to get exactly 105. But you might ask, what happens if I have a longer back focus distance or a shorter back focus distance? Well, if you look at this curve here, if you go longer, you'll get more focal reduction. And that will speed up your optical system further and give you a wider field of view. If you go shorter in back focus distance, you'll have less focal reductions. It won't speed up the system as much, and you will have a slightly smaller field of view than you would have at the correct back focus distance. But don't forget, if you're not at the correct back focus distance, you may have field curvature issues, you may have misshaping stars at the edge of your field of view, you can have vignetting and so forth. But people doing EAA play around with that back focus distance all the time. Typically, people like to make it longer to get more focal reduction in a faster optical system. And it's up to you whether those aberrations that you see by making the back focus distance longer than 105 millimeter are acceptable to you. And if you have a camera with a fairly small chip those aberrations might actually be outside of the field of view of your chip. So it's okay to try more or less focal reduction, and that's really up to you depending on what it is you're trying to do. So we have one more question to address before we can start. What if I'm using a cooled camera versus a non-cooled camera? Or what if I'm using a camera from another company aside from these ones I'm showing you here from ZWO Optical? What if I'm using one from Player One or QHY or one of the many other camera vendors? Well, there's where we're in luck, because there seems to be a pretty clear standard, at least for the vast majority of the deep sky cameras. And the standard is on two things. First, the connection on the front of the cameras seems to have a standard of M42 female threads. Second, the back focus distance of the chip inside the camera, regardless of whether it's the cooled or uncooled camera, is 6.5 millimeters from this red flange surface, this flat surface here on the front of the camera. And so typically they'll provide you with something like this 11 millimeter spacing. And if you look at the diagram for your camera, like this one here from ZWO Optical, you'll see that the spacing from the chip to the front of this 11 millimeter adapter is 17.5 millimeters, and the distance from the chip to the front face of the camera body itself is 6.5 millimeters, and that seems to be an industry standard. So what that means is the couplers I show you with these cameras should work regardless of whose camera you use. Now there are some small exceptions. Some of the planetary cameras use a slightly different back spacing for the chip, so please check the diagram for your specific camera first before you buy the couplers that I'm going to show you. With the straight through approach, you need the rail extension. In the case of the 6SE, I've had to move the scope about 2 inches further forward than you could without the rail extension, and you can see on the uncooled camera I have no problem clearing the base. Now a cooled camera is going to actually require pushing this much further forward, and you can do that, but at the expense of some stability of the optical tube. And with the 8-inch on this SE mount, you're going to have to push it still further forward because the OTA is longer, but you can do that. And if you're on the Evolution mount, it has more clearance at the base to begin with, so I think you can get away on the 8-inch pushing it further forward. 9¼ inch, I think it'll work, but people already complain that the 9¼ inch Evolution seems to be a bit wobbly to begin with without adding a rail and pushing it further forward, but you can give it a try. And on those scopes, you might actually want to try the longer rail from Celestron as well. So now let me go through in detail the components that we're going to need to put together this back focus solution. Now, as I said before, for the straight through approach, you're going to need a rail extension. And the cheaper solution is this one from SVBony, it's $30. The one from Celestron is $65. They both work. This one will give you the ability to move the OTA about 2-3 inches further forward in the mount. This one will allow you to move the OTA 3 to 4 inches further forward in the mount, but be careful, you don't want to move it too far forward so you're too unbalanced. Either work. This one here with the slots, this one with a small slot and a bunch of holes here, so the connection is a little different between the two, but choose which one works best for you. And as I said before, I will put links to all of these parts down below the video to make it easier for you to find them. All right, so now we have the rail extension. We can move the scope further forward, and we want the straight through design. So the first thing we need is the Celestron T adapter to SC. That screws onto the front here. That gives us 50 millimeters of back spacing. The next thing I suggest is a blue Fireball 37.5 millimeter M42 spacer. I don't have that specific one with me. Instead, at the moment, I have a 30 millimeter and a 7.5. I recommend just get the 37.5 single element one. Make it simpler on yourself. They all have rifling on the inside, so as to reduce the amount of light reflection off the inside of these things. That gives you an additional 37.5. So we're at 50 plus 37.5. And these, make sure what you have screws all the way in. Otherwise, you're going to have a different optical spacing than you think. And then with the ZWO cameras, they typically give you these M42 to T2 adapters. It's female to female. It screws directly onto the threads on the camera itself. And as I mentioned before, the spacing from here, this flat surface, to the chip is 17.5. So 17.5, 37.5 gives us 55, 50, 105 exactly. All right, so there you have the straight through approach. I think that's pretty simple. The only challenge in the straight through approach is not to unbalance your scope too much by pushing it too far forward. Just push it enough that you can clear coming into and out of 90 degrees so that you don't crash into the base of the mount. Now, what if you wanted to be able to vary the spacing from 105 millimeters, as we discussed earlier? Well, there's several ways of doing that. You can get yourself a set of these T adjustment rings from Baader. They come in slightly more than 1 millimeter, several millimeters, down to sub-millimeter adjustments. And the way those work is you would unscrew this, take this, I think this is made out of Delrin or some other plastic, slide it over the threads, and then you tighten this thing back on, and it will increase the spacing by the amount of the thickness of that spacer ring. And as I said, they come in sizes sub-millimeter, like 0.3, 0.5, 0.6, to a millimeter or to several millimeters. Now, if you want to make a bigger incremental change, you could also use a fixed spacer. And these spacers come in different sizes, 2, 3. This is a 5 millimeter spacer. You wouldn't use this Delrin ring. You would put this in there, and you could increase the spacing by that. If you wanted to reduce the spacing, instead of putting this 37.5 millimeter one in here, you could use a smaller one, like this 30 millimeter one. And so you would have reduced this to below 100 millimeters. And another elegant way of doing this is with this Baader Varilock. So this is the Baader T2 extension. It allows you to adjust the spacing from 29 to 46. So remember, what we need in here is 37.5. So if we adjust this, you can get 37.5. So this consists of 3 pieces. This piece here will thread all the way out. This is a locking ring. What I like about the Baader system is it has a scale on it that we can adjust, and it looks like you can adjust this in even half of a millimeter increments. So you could actually use this as your 37.5 millimeter spacer. If you were to adjust it to 37.5 millimeters, then you thread this end on to the Celestron T adapter, and then you screw this end on here on this side, and then you would have your 37.5 total. So with that Baader Varilock on there, we now have 105 millimeter spacing, but I can adjust this to whatever I like. I can make it a little bit more because we've used 37.5. It has a total of 46 millimeters of extension. So we can go another 8.5 millimeters, so we can go to over 110 millimeter spacing, or we can reduce that by 8 millimeters spacing so that we're even below 100 millimeters. Now I mentioned the Varilock because it is very versatile. However, the Varilock is kind of expensive. That thing is $87. So I did want to give you options. So for the straight through approach, the simplest solution is the Celestron T adapter at 50 millimeters, the Blue Fireball 37.5 millimeter spacer. the 11 millimeter spacer that typically comes with the ZWO camera, and then the camera itself. But there's all these variations in between that you can use. Now, what if you wanted to fit a filter drawer in there, like this one from ZWO, so you could put different filters in the field of view during your session? Well, first you're going to need a filter drawer like this one from ZWO, and the spec on this filter drawer is 21 millimeters, so this gives you a 21 millimeter additional spacing. But the challenge on this particular filter drawer is that on one side it has female M48 threads. So we're typically using M42, not M48, so we're going to have to make allowance for that difference. So for the straight through approach with the filter drawer, we're still going to need the rail extension, of course, but we're going to need a different set of couplers. We're going to still start with the Celestron T adapter, but now we're going to have to get ourselves the 7.5 millimeter spacer along with a 10 millimeter spacer, which gives us 17.5. The half is the important point. It would be great if they had a 17.5 millimeter spacer, but I haven't been able to find one. Now we're going to take the M42 adapter that typically comes with your ZWO camera and is on the front. This is female to female. We'll thread that on. That's 11 millimeters. And now we'll thread the M42 side of the filter drawer into that. That's 21 millimeters. Now, to get this to fit on here, we're going to need ZWO's M42 to M48 adapter. Now, this is M42 threads on the inside, M42 threads on the outside. This will thread right onto the front of the camera, and now it'll thread onto the filter drawer and it'll bottom out. So now let's check the optical path length. We've got 50 plus 7.5 plus 10. That gives us 67.5 plus 11. That's 78.5 plus 21 is 99.5 millimeters. And then the 6.5 millimeters back spacing. So that gives us 106 millimeters back spacing exactly. Well, wait, 106? I thought the objective was 105. Well, don't forget, we're going to put a filter in here. And you need to take into account that the optical glass in the filter has a different index of refraction than the air that's in between everything else. And so we need to add 1 millimeter, typically 1 millimeter, for a 3 millimeter thick filter. So this will get you the correct optical backspacing when using a 3 millimeter filter. Don't worry if your filter is 2 millimeters, that's probably close enough. So there you have the two straight through solutions, with and without the filter. Again, you might want to adjust the spacing. You can use the spacers here, the very thin spacers I mentioned before. You can use a slightly bigger extension. I don't think the Baader Varilock really works very well in here because we really need this female to female 11 millimeter adapter here, and the Baader Varilock is not going to give us female to female, so that's very important. But once again, make sure that when you screw these together, everything is flush. Otherwise, you're not getting the spacing that you're expecting to get. And in terms of the optical connections, it doesn't matter whether I'm using a cooled camera or an uncooled camera, as long as the backspacing of the, as long as the recess of the chip is 6.5 millimeters from the back of this, you'll get the correct backspacing. Now, of course, the cooled camera is going to require a lot more clearance, and I don't think you're really going to get that without very much unbalancing your scope with the extension rails, but you can try it if you want. One thing else I would point out on that M42 to M48 connector is always put it on so that the two notches, there's two notches on one side of this thing. Sometimes it can get stuck on here and hard to get off. So at least you want the notches so you can get your fingernail in there and get it off. You'd be surprised how some of these things tend to get stuck and then you can't get them off. So what if you don't want to put a rail extension on because you don't want to unbalance your scope on the mount? Or maybe you can't get enough room to use a cooled camera, or the camera you have is too large. Then the only other solution is going to be using a diagonal. And the challenge with diagonals is that the optical path length is usually very large, approaching 100 millimeters, 60, 70, over 100 millimeters in optical path length. And the second thing is, most of them don't even tell you what the optical path length is. So the solution I came up with help from people online on the Cloudy Nights forum, is this Baader Planetarium prism diagonal, which does have an optical path length specified as 35 millimeters. And the other thing is, this one I purchased without the adapters on either end for eyepieces and so forth, because we don't need them. They're only going to add to the optical path length and put us over. This one here cost $141, so it is the most expensive element that we're going to have in this optical train. And having the extra glass in the path, plus the clear aperture on this thing is 30 millimeters, so it's not as large as a typical 2-inch diagonal, will mean that we have some light loss and potentially some vignetting, but I think this is the best that we can do. So let's put this optical train together. So the first thing we're going to need to connect to the focal reducer is an SCT to T2 adapter. Now, being frugal, I found this adapter here, which is a single piece adapter. You can find this on Amazon. You can find this on the Astronomy websites. Here are some examples of that. Do not buy these. These don't work. These single element pieces barely screw on. You get like a 1/16 of a turn. And also, there's no way to adjust the angle of rotation of this optical train. Stay away from this, even though it looks cheaper. You need to buy this Baader SCT to T2 adapter, which is a 2-element piece. And I'm sorry to say, it is expensive at $59, but what can you do? So this piece will go on here first, and this is going to allow us to make adjustments to the angle of this optical train. Next is the Baader prism diagonal. That screws directly on here. Okay, want to make sure we're tight enough. Like I said, if you want to rotate, you loosen this thread part, and then you can rotate the diagonal. Next, we're going to add a blue fireball 18 millimeter extension. Into that, we're going to connect this SVBony 3-piece adapter. Now, this is very much like the Baader Varilock. It has 3 pieces, just like the Varilock, so you can adjust the spacing here and lock it in place. This only goes up to 35 millimeters. I think it goes from 24 to 35 millimeters. I have it set at 26.5, and that goes on next. Then we have the ZWO M42 female to female on both sides. Then next, the camera body itself. Now, this Baader SCT to T2 adapter, you'll find it online a number of different places. You'll see it spec'd at an optical path length of 8, 9, and 10 millimeters. I'm not sure why the different vendors for the same part give different optical path lengths, but I measured the optical path length of this myself and came to the conclusion that it's 8 millimeters. So we have 8 plus 35, that's 43. Then we have 18, that's 61. And then 26 and a half, makes it 87.5, plus 11 is 98.5, plus the recess of the chip, 6.5. 98.5 plus 6.5 is exactly 105. Now, if you had a cooled camera like this one, you could fit that on here just as well, and I'll show you shortly how this fits onto the back of the SCT and clears the base even with the cooled camera. Now, what if you want to play with the spacing? Well, that's the beauty of the SVBony 3-piece adapter here. This will allow you you just unlock the locking ring and then make the adjustment to the spacing more or less as you like. If you need more spacing, you can use a fixed spacer adapter like we talked about before, 2, 3, 5, 10, whatever. If you want less spacing, you can use the SVBony as well and reduce the spacing there, or you could replace this 18mm spacer with a 10mm spacer or something like that. Or you could also use one of these Baader rings. As I said, these come in various sizes, sub-millimeter to several millimeters, so you have lots of control over the spacing if that's what you want. With this diagonal approach, I have a lot of room to clear at the base of the mount. In fact, you can see I can get a cooled camera in here without any problem. And I have about 3 more inches on this OTA where I could push it further forward in the mount, but I don't need to do that because it clears very easily here, as you can see, with some room to spare. Now on an 8-inch on an SE mount, you're going to have to push it a little further forward, but you're not going to need the rail. And on the Evolution mount, should have plenty of clearance on the 8-inch, and I think you'll even have clearance on the 9.25-inch on that Evolution mount. Now, it's very important to make sure that the camera is out at an angle so that you do have all of that clearance. But as I said, there's tons and tons of room here to get that in and not interfere and pass right through 90 degrees with no problem at all. So just like the case of the straight through design, you may find that you want a filter drawer so you can put filters in and out, and you may want to use that with the diagonal approach. So let me show you how to do that. Starts off exactly the same with the Baader SCT 2T adapter connected to the focal reducer and to the Baader prism diagonal. So next we need 24 millimeters of spacing, and since I couldn't find a single 24 millimeter spacer, I'm going to use the Blue Fireball 18 and 6 millimeter spacers. Screw that on there. If you wanted to, you could use the SVBony 3-piece adjustable spacer and set it at 24. That would work just fine as well. After that comes the ZWO M42 female to M42 female. And then we put this ZWO filter drawer in there. Now, the trick with the filter drawer is that one side is M42 male threads, the other side is M48 female threads. And so the M48 doesn't work very well with our M42 adapters. But let's do the T2 side. Then we're going to have to use this ZWO M42 to M48 adapter. Now this has M42 threads on the inside and M48 threads on the outside. And this will connect to the face of the camera, and you just screw that on there. And this will actually provide 0 optical distance. Now one trick, when you screw this on here, this spacer has 2 little slots in it on one side but not the other. I recommend that you keep the slots on the outward side because sometimes these things get stuck and then it's easy to put your fingernail in there to get it off. And so that then will connect to the M48 threads on the back of the ZWO filter drawer. And then you can take the filters in and out while you're doing your session. Now, let's add up the optical train. We have our 8 and 35 is 43, plus 24 is 67, 11 is 78, 21 is 99, and then 6.5 for the spacing of the chip. That's 105.5. Now, remember, if we're going to use a filter, we do need to adjust by 1 millimeter for a 3 millimeter thick filter, about 0.7 millimeters for a 2 millimeter thick filter. So we're at 105. Now, that might be a good compromise, because if you're using filters sometimes and no filter other times, 105.5 is a nice balance between the 105 without a filter and 106 with a filter. However, if you're a purist and you really need to get that additional spacing, just use one of these 0.5 millimeter spacers, and you can put that anywhere here in the optical path. Just fits over the threads like I showed you before, and it'll add 0.5 millimeter to this, so you'll get 106 exact. Now I'm going to demonstrate the clearance with this right angle filter drawer design with the larger cooled camera. And normally you might put all of these pieces on one at a time, but since I have it assembled, I'm going to show you you can actually put it on assembled. So the first thing you want to do is loosen this piece here, so you can rotate the focal reducer to thread it on, get it on there tight. Then you want to tighten the SCT to T2 adapter. And position this so that you're not going to hit the base of the mount when you slew through 90 degrees. So let's demonstrate that. And you see I have plenty of room here to clear at 90 degrees. I still have about 3 or so inches that I can shove this OTA further forward, some of which you're going to need for the 8-inch if you're on the SC mount. But again, I think you'll be fine with the 8 and the 6 on the SE mount, and I think you'll also be fine with the 8 and even the 9 1/4 on the Evolution mounts, since there's a bit more clearance at the base on that mount design. So that wraps up our discussion of the 4 different solutions to back focus spacing, so that you can use a camera on your fork mounted OTA and still be able to point at the zenith without crashing into the base of the mount. Now, each of those solutions has its advantages and disadvantages. The straight through, as I said before, avoids any additional optics in the light path, which is great, but you do have to add a rail extension or a longer rail and push the OTA further forward. And so you have to be careful you don't push it too far forward to make it unstable and wobbly, especially if there's some wind blowing around. The diagonal approach avoids that problem. You don't have to push the OTA so far forward, and you don't need a rail extension. And with the diagonal, you can easily use a cooled camera as well. The disadvantage is the extra optics in the light path, which can always degrade the amount of light reaching your camera, plus some possible vignetting from the limited clear aperture of the diagonal itself. So pick which one works best for you. I've detailed each solution down below the video where it says show more or more. If you click on that, it'll expand and you'll see links to each component for each of the 4 solutions that I showed you, plus some of the optional components that I mentioned as well. As always, if you learned something from this video, please like it. That helps other people like you find it more easily. You may also want to subscribe to this channel so you can be alerted when I produce more videos, which you may find useful. And I encourage you to take a look at my website, californiaskies.com, where you can find in-depth equipment reviews and write-ups on astronomy and astronomy techniques. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching.